one of the things that you guys didn't talk about that I think is really, really important to understand is that, really for the longest time, the human performance professionals across all of the different LCATs have been historically depressed. My personal opinion, colleges and universities took advantage of your passion, and they're doing it today. Like I talked to somebody the other day, said he got offered a job for $32,000 a year. Like, tell me how that's a living wage. It's not, but that's the industry you guys are in.
Hey team, welcome back to Drew and Alex's Fireside Chats, episode number 604.
Is it a fireside chat if there's a guest? I thought that only applied to episodes with just us.
Drew and Alex's roundtable discussions with guests, episode number 604. Here's the deal. How many weeks ago now would this have been?
It's a few, whatever.
A couple weeks ago.
I keep as good count of the weeks as I keep count of the episodes.
Yeah, a couple weeks ago, we posted an episode entitled, "Is Contracting Killing Strength and Conditioning?"
Possibly a slightly clickbaity title.
Intentionally clickbaity, intentionally controversial, and the hot takes within the episode, again, were sort of intentionally meant to trigger some people. However, I will say pretty much everything we said was backed by either our own experiences or experiences from coaches or professionals in this space who had kind of reported to us that this has happened, that's happened, this is what I've experienced, whatever. Obviously, those kinds of conversations rattle some feathers, especially when...
Do you say rattle some feathers? Because you got to choose rattle some cages or ruffle some feathers.
You don't have to.
I don't think
those kinds of
rattle.
Conversations ruffle some cages. And so we decided appropriately, like, hey, let's have the other side come on. And we even said it in the episode, I said some things, you said some things. Someone please prove us wrong. We want to know the full story. Why is it that every strength coach feels like they're not getting paid enough?
I could be wrong here, but I think everything that we were wrong about was stuff you said.
I know, but I'm trying to make it sound like a joint thing. We're doing this together. Anyway, so what better place to go to than the contracting companies themselves? Today, we are talking with Chris Larkin. Alex, please explain to us who Chris is.
Chris is here to set the record straight a little bit.
Straighter. I don't know if it's straight.
And he certainly didn't come at us real angry or anything. He just volunteered his services to correct some misconceptions in the space and things like that. And he is uniquely qualified to do that, not just because of current involvement in contracting, but he has a history in the space that makes him unique among people. I think the perspective I like is that he has been both on the government side of this, the military side of this, and on the contracting side of this. There's not a ton of people who've done both. And it's definitely valuable. And some people in the contracting space are just business people doing business things. Chris is actually passionate about the product he's providing, right? So who is he? Why did he become so passionate about this? Chris is LMR Technical Group's CEO and co-founder, and he has been both enlisted and an officer in Air Force Special Warfare with extensive involvement over the course of that career in military human performance in a whole bunch of different capacities. He has 28 total years in the Air Force. He was enlisted as a combat controller and commissioned as a special tactics officer. And he was already advocating for military human performance initiatives, even when he was enlisted. He was the first squadron commander at the Special Tactics Training Squadron. He helped establish the Combat Athlete Program, which predates POTFF. People in the SOCOM space will know that POTFF is kind of everywhere in SOCOM now. He worked with Air Force Research Lab and the U.S. Air Force Academy Human Performance Lab on that initiative. He built human performance specific facilities at the Special Tactics Training Squadron and at the 23rd Special Tactics Squadron, which were some of the first of those built across the entire DoD. And he even ran one of the first ever human performance symposiums. It brought together industry, academia, and other military units. And that predates things like the modern NSCA tactical conference and things like that. When he went to the Joint Advanced Warfighting School, he wrote a thesis titled Combat Fitness, a Concept Vital to National Defense. And he was an operational squadron commander when POTIF did eventually come to Air Force Special Operations Command. He even deployed his human performance staff into Afghanistan to help expedite the recovery process for his operators returning from missions. His credentials include a bachelor's in exercise science. He did, in fact, go to master fitness trainer, and he is also an ACSM exercise leader and a USA triathlon coach. And we don't really get into it during the episode, but he's a pretty accomplished athlete in his own right. Division I cross country at Southwest Texas State University, represented the Air Force in downhill skiing, triathlon, pentathlon, and Ironman, including 3 Ironman finishes. And he has 3,000 parachute jumps to his name, including numerous demonstrations at events like NFL, MLB, and NASCAR games/races. Pretty cool stuff.
Yeah. So Chris is more experienced than us,
Mhm.
smarter than us, way more qualified than we are to comment on the points that we made in the previous episode. So I think what I would say to folks is think of this as part 2 of kind of a 2-part discussion, and potentially there's more parts to come, but we wanted to, given the nature of where, I mean, first and foremost, where kind of Army embedded human performance is at the moment with H2F, but I think more broadly, where tactical human performance is, where most, if not all of the strength and conditioning coaches, and then some of the peripheral staff, but certainly strength and conditioning coaches, it's very much contract based. We've had episodes in the past where we sort of explored the differences between contracting and civilian and active duty. The contracting killing strength and conditioning episode came along because of some of the frustrations that we kept hearing from contractors about the way that things were going down. And so now we finally get the chance to talk to somebody on the other side of the line, I suppose, who is in contracting, who understands how it works, who has bid for and successfully won contracts, and has also employed people. And some of the people that listen to this podcast are, in fact, employed by this company. So there are some roads that we weren't able to go down for hopefully pretty obvious reasons. But I do think that we did a good job taking the things that we brought up in, we'll call it episode 1, allowing Chris to expound on some of those. And quite frankly, at least for me, eating a bunch of humble pie and being like, dude, show me where I was wrong, help me understand this so that I can get a better appreciation of kind of the landscape that we're working in. So maybe we'll get more hate mail from this one. We certainly got some hate mail from the first one, but no press is bad press, I think is what they say.
That is not how.
That's what they say.
If you say no press is bad, like there's no such
There's
thing
no
as
such
bad
thing as
press,
bad
I
press.
think is where you're going with that.
You're
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Just
You
ruffling
were
cages
close.
and rattling feathers. Listen, guys, sometimes it's hard to do this live. Okay.
I'll just say, and I'll admit, I'm not an expert on this stuff either. I got some stuff wrong too, obviously. But the thing I keep coming back to in conversations like these, and this might be one we return to. I don't know how much of our audience cares about the whole contracting thing. Who knows?
The contractors.
Contractors definitely care. I don't know how many of the active duty service members care, and I definitely don't know how many like the outside of the military space people who just found us because of human performance stuff care. We have lots of different people in our audience. But I will say there's a theme here that applies to more than just contracting that I kind of want you to keep in mind as you listen. And especially if there's somebody out there who like has insight on this. This is a classic situation of the problems are never any one person's fault or any one organization's fault. The problems come from flawed systems and people, it's really easy to get caught up in like blaming either the military or the government or the contracting stuff or the contracting company or individual person, whatever. And usually none of that's the case. Usually most people are doing their best in the situation they're in the role they have. And I think defense contracting and particularly defense like staffing contracts where they're providing people, that system has a lot of flaws. And we do talk about some of them here.
Talk about some solutions too.
We do talk about some like potential solution kind of stuff, but I don't think as far as I know, there's no like space where real conversations are happening about the way ahead on some of those structural problems. And I don't think we really solve any of this until we get to that part of the conversation.
Yeah, I don't think I walked away from this conversation with Chris thinking that there's like malicious actors somewhere intentionally screwing people over. Though the NSCA may still So
Drew wants to start a fight.
fit somewhere in there. But no, I think people should recognize from this conversation, like there's certainly areas of improvement, like you mentioned. There are certainly things that could be fixed, and hopefully things that will get fixed, because we saw just last week or maybe 2 weeks ago with the Army, the plan is to roll H2F out to the entire Army, not just bits and pieces of it. And I would imagine that inevitably the Navy will follow suit, the Air Force will follow suit, the Marine Corps, who knows what they ever do. But there will be more positions, there will be more contracts, there will be more opportunities and areas for improvement. I'm not going to sit here and say that our conversation with Chris is going to change the world, but hopefully it at least enlightens some folks and like we said, provides a more robust palette of colors with which to paint the canvas of the conversation that is strength and conditioning and contracting. So enjoy. Just as a starting point to kind of lay the foundation here, can you, and we will have done some of this in kind of the intro to the episode, but can you kind of walk us through maybe the tail end of your military career and then your journey into contracting to get to where you are at now?
So by trade, I'm a combat controller, enlisted for 12 years. And then I got out, got my degree in exercise sports science, and rejoined the Air Force as an officer, 16 years as a special tactics officer, finishing my career, last couple of assignments, squadron commander for the special tactics training squadron, the 23rd special tactics operational squadron, and then deputy group commander at the 720th special tactics group. And I had the unique opportunity really at the special tactics training squadron. We were working closely with the Air Force Research Lab and the Air Force Academy Human Performance Lab to do many of the things that human performance programs are doing today. And this is in the 2007, 2008 timeframe. And then fast forward to operational command at the 2-3 STS. We fell under the SOCOM POTF program. At that point, AFSOC was brought into the contract, and all of the POTF contractors came to our squadron at that. While I was in squadron command, we built the human performance facility just prior to that. And so I got an opportunity to integrate the human performance professionals and the operators. And so that was very eye-opening. How do you bring a whole bunch of people who don't know anything, or for the most part don't know anything about the military, into a squadron and convince special operations guys that are going downrange every 12 to 18 months that these people are here to help. And so during my career, that was one of the things that we worked hard on. We actually deployed our human performance professionals into Afghanistan and did a post-deployment check, and the staff was able to set up appointments and treatment prior to our redeployment. And so when they showed up, that recovery time was shrunk, because now they're not waiting for appointments. They're not waiting for diagnosis. They're already on the road to recovery. So that's just some of the stuff. When I retired in 2013, I went to work for a small company here in Northwest Florida that was doing many of the same things we were doing on active duty. Worked there for about 4 years as their VP of operations. Got a great opportunity to get my feet wet in government contracting and learn a lot about it. I moved to a mid-sized company in the Hampton Roads area, where I was their senior business development person. Submitted a couple hundred bids, or about 100 bids in 2 years, won about 250 million in government contracting, learned a huge amount about the process. Hey, had a great staff. And so as I had an opportunity to start LMR Technical Group just almost 6 years ago, we started operations in January 2019. I was able to take the knowledge I learned in both of those companies and start LMR.
with all that in mind, that's a lot of experience with human performance. That's a lot of experience with the military. That's a lot of experience with contracting. How did we do talking about contracting military human performance on
You
our
know more than
previous
us on
episode?
a lot of things, and this is a great platform for you to tell us how wrong we are.
Well, I would just say that it's not that you're wrong. It's that you don't have the same perspective.
Mhm.
And so it's hard to understand how and why things are decided in terms of the government. And, I'll just say that there were some assertions that you guys made that I think were uninformed, and they're easy things for people to believe. And, while I think there's some blame that can be placed on the contracting companies, I think there's equal, if not more, blame to be placed on other parts of the system. And I'm not going to say it's not individuals, it's the system, right?
Mhm.
So the government says we want to set up a contract that is going to provide strength coaches and cognitive performance specialists for X amount of Army brigades and battalions. And the Army says, okay, that's pretty good. The experts are going to say, hey, we want coaches with 10 plus years of experience, and we want all these certifications, master's degrees, professional sports. We want to be just like the coaches on POTUS, right? The government, there are people in the process who are going to do what they call an independent government cost estimate. They're going to compare that to what the budget says they have available. And they're going to make some hard decisions. And they're going to say, as they did in some of the contracts we're talking about, that we can't afford to have coaches with 10 years. We can't afford to have coaches with master's degrees. The best we can afford are coaches with a bachelor's degree and 3 years experience and a NSCA certification. And so the requirement is set by a number of different factors. And then from that requirement, the RFP, or request for proposal, is built based on the performance work statement or the statement of work, which really contains all the information that they want the government contracting company to do. Then they have to decide how they're going to solicit or what their acquisition strategy is. And so acquisition strategy is affected by as many factors as the requirement is. Contracting agency that is going to run the acquisition, the contracting vehicle that the acquisition is going to be placed on. And those are two big things that dictate how that RFP is going to be solicited and then evaluated by the government. And so, we'll take a nondescript requirement. We'll say that it's going to go out over the open sam.gov net, and they send it out, but the contracting office is busy, not very experienced, constrained by the timeline. They have to spend the money or award the contract. And so they make some decisions about how they're going to evaluate it. An evaluation is a very difficult thing for contracting. They really want the end users to be able to help them build objective criteria that they can grade the technical proposals by. Most end users, operators, operational unit personnel don't have the experience to build those objective requirements to build into the evaluation criteria. And so in a lot of instances, contracts are competed, maybe not at face value at the lowest price technically acceptable criteria. There might be some contracting people who would say, well, we're competing it as best value, and LPTA, or lowest price technically acceptable, is on the spectrum of best value.
Mhm.
Right. And so that criteria and how they apply that criteria is based on a lot of those factors. And we as government contractors don't know all the reasons. And I would say, I don't think either of you know all the reasons why the government decides. So, if you want to talk about H2F, why did the government choose to place that contract on HR Solutions? It's a best in class vehicle that the Army uses, but there's some things that they didn't evaluate because it's on that contract vehicle. The OHWS, or the Air Combat Command IDIQ contract that recently was awarded to 6 companies. The first procurement that went out was LPTA, and those decisions are not made by contracting companies. So what we have to do as a contracting company is we have to look at the RFP, look at what the requirement is and the evaluation criteria. And then there's some knowledge decisions that I think companies make. And Drew, you made a comment that I think is a little bit unfair, but I think there are companies that do this. Either they don't know, or there are companies that purposely bid very, very low in anticipation of getting a modification to the contract and getting paid more money down during the execution of the contract. And there are some contracts in this industry that has happened to. And I've been beat many times by lower price bids. And we were beat on the first ACC IDIQ task order bid by a lower price. I pride myself on being able to assess the requirement and bid what I would call middle of the road salaries so that you have some room left or right of that. And so now I don't know if that answers your question or it helps explain a little bit more about, the process, but the reality is that it's a very, very complex problem, and it has a lot of decision makers in it, and the contracting company doesn't get a vote until the very end. And then once we submit it, we're not part of source selection, and we're not part of the government's evaluation team. So it's hard to say exactly what they're doing and how they're evaluating those bids. But I can tell you that, when the government says, hey, we're going to compete this lowest price technically acceptable, there is a process by which they take the lowest price and they give the technical solution to the technical team. And if they read it and it makes sense to them and they say, yes, this is technically compliant, then they award it to that lowest price. Now, there are some techniques and processes that they can apply to ensure that that price is reasonable and realistic. That doesn't always happen. And so, that is, something that government contracting companies don't have control over, how they do that. I'll stop there and see what questions you might have.
Well, before I ask a question, I have to thank you for calling me out. We did preface all of our dumb points in the last episode by saying, please, someone tell us that we're wrong. And so here we find ourselves. Can I ask really quickly, though, because I know Alex has a follow-on. you mentioned with the lowest price technically acceptable, and I could have this all wrong in my head, but like it sounds like there's a team of, I guess, technical experts in place that determine what is good and bad. And from like a human performance maybe standpoint, does that team consist of like human performance type experts that would say, yeah, this fits the bill or this doesn't? Like how does that work? If that makes sense.
Well, that's a really good question, Drew. But we don't dictate who's on the source selection technical committee.
Okay.
And generally price portions of solicitations are evaluated by contracting officers. Those are separate evaluation processes. Who would I say are on evaluation teams? I would say that, people who are in the managing organizations, let's say like the contracting officers representative or the core
Mhm.
or the A core. There are some human performance professionals on staffs at CIMT or ACC headquarters or SOCOM headquarters who, my guess is, they would probably sit on that technical evaluation committee. It's going to be made up of a couple of people. The bigger the solicitation, the more people that are probably going to be on that committee. And I think in some cases, when it gets bigger, you're going to have a mix of people. You're going to have some people like the core who probably doesn't have human performance expertise. They might know how to spell it, but they'll bring their experts. And, at ACC headquarters, they have physical therapists and doctors and people on the staff. At CIMT, they have strength coaches and athletic trainers who are on the staff, and data experts and research analysts who potentially can be on those evaluation teams. It's just hard to say. And again, contracting companies don't have anything to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
That's completely up to the government to determine the makeup of that team and the evaluation process that is implemented.
Mm-hmm.
This might go a little bit all over the place. I think part of the reason you were the perfect person to bring on for this conversation is because you've been on this from both ends. You've been the like commander receiving the service at the unit all the way over to being on the contracting side of this thing. And most of the problems we end up digging into in the conversations on here are multifactorial, and because it's the military, involve a bunch of layers of bureaucracy. And as you were talking, it got me thinking about conversations we've been having recently around like veteran disability, because there's a lot of people who want to blame individuals for working the system, and then there are other people who want to blame the people who set up the system, and you can't really change the system because there's the politics of it and the money of it. And like we're seeing a lot of the same problems here, where there's a bunch of layers where the command that knows what they want has to work through contracting processes that they don't control, and all of these pieces. And I wonder if I'm like getting the right picture of this. When I see it, I see layers of bureaucracy and people that are trying to work through it that don't necessarily have experience in contracting. And the people who do have experience in it aren't the ones who are making the decisions usually, because they're usually out being the contractors. Is that like a decently accurate picture of how all this goes? Is it that messy? Because that would explain a lot.
Yeah, I would venture to say that your assessment is pretty accurate. The other thing that I'll say is that senior officers, in many instances, are a little bit gun shy about being involved in the contracting process, right? Like they don't want to be involved or have, weigh in, because they don't want the perception that they've influenced the acquisition process. As a guy who was not super senior, but fairly senior in the military, I think I can say that without too much trouble. There certainly are officers who are not afraid of that, but in general, I think you have some some hesitation by some senior leaders to weigh in and lead, kind of drive home the solution. But what you said, it is, there are layers, and it's messy. And I'll say this, the other thing that I think that is relevant here, much like in the operational career fields across the DoD, we've promoted people very, very quickly. We brought people up into higher ranks quicker than when I was a E5 in the Air Force. When you were an E5 in the Air Force, we could do, and this is in the mid 80s, you could do anything. You could run every mission that we wanted to do, and you had a ton of experience. And now we're promoting people quicker. They have less time on planet. They have less operational experience. And I think in these other specialties, to include contracting, I think it's very similar that we're promoting people very quickly. And so we're asking a lot of them earlier in their career, and that makes it more difficult. And if you look at how many contracts are awarded every year and how many contracts are being run and how much money is being spent on government contracts, it's a lot. And so the contracting office and the acquisition professionals across the DoD are super, super busy. And so those are some challenges I think that we're dealing with, and the downstream ripples are what we get. We get the LPTA source selection, we get the technical evaluation criteria that's not effective. Like when you read a proposal, when we write a proposal and we submit it, and the technical team is looking at it, they have criteria that's laid out in the request for proposal, and the instruction to offerers, and the evaluation criteria. And that should guide the evaluators to understand, if the proposal makes sense, is the proposal adding value to the government over and above what the government is asking for. And so there is a grading criteria that is normally associated with these proposals, and so you have to make that super objective and not subjective. And so some of those things are very difficult to evaluate. Let's just use as a strength coach, for example. Like I'm gonna, an objective criteria would be that we're gonna ensure that our strength coaches get, I don't know, 100 hours of professional development every year over and above, what they, doing work for the government. This will ensure that those coaches are, up to speed on the latest technology, techniques, and procedures to be a better coach for the staff. But if you just say, I'm gonna, provide professional development for my coach, that's hard to say. Is that really value added or not? And so those criteria are important as they lay out the evaluation criteria.
So as you're talking, and I'll take a quick aside. Two things for the audience. One, he mentioned the amount of contracts being processed and awarded and things like that. If you're ever bored, just Google DoD contracts, click the first link that came up, and it just posts each day the contracts awarded. I looked earlier today, the first one was over $1 billion, and then it was followed by a number of multi-million-dollar contracts. Just to get a sense of scale, that's worth doing. But to what I'm going to ask you about, if there's one phrase I learned to hate over the last few years, it's lessons learned and best practices, because usually they're lessons that we haven't actually learned, and they're practices that we think might work okay, but we're not sure.
Yeah.
Like just because you take something and put it in a document does not mean the lesson was learned.
What?
And I think you're very aware of this. A lot of the conventional military is now embracing embedded human performance based on theoretically the lessons learned from things like
Mhm.
POTIF and SOCOM.
Yep.
But I don't think we learned all the important lessons necessarily. I think we're relearning the hard way a lot of the same
Mhm.
lessons POTIF had to learn the hard way
At scale.
at scale and
Yeah.
hard and painfully and in public. And I wonder, having been exposed to some of that, if we look at contracting specifically, what are some lessons we could have and should have probably learned or are currently relearning that POTIF figured out a decade or so ago?
That's a great question, Alex, because I am frustrated myself because I truly believe that we should be light years ahead of where we are today based on, 12, 13 years, 14 years of POTIF. Unfortunately, I think early on, there was some challenges, that the SOCOM community was facing. And I don't believe that, holistically any, and we can just say lessons observed have been communicated to the community. Um, and, and I would say that goes for inside POTIF. Like, the components in SOCOM, AFSOC, MARSOC, USASOC, Naval Special Warfare, they are doing their own program, right? USASOC is Thor 3, and NSW really was on the forefront of this before POTIF ever started. And so I would tell you that, lessons observed are even more challenging inside of SOCOM. And so to think now, I think they leveraged what they did on Thor 3 to kind of establish the groundwork for 722 and, some of the things that were early in the H2F contract. But there's lots of things that they didn't learn, and that we're learning again at scale. And I stood up in front of the pilot community at the aircrew performance seminar. It's now almost 2 years ago, and said, you have a great opportunity here to, lay the foundation for the future as you try to guide the entire aircrew performance model. And everybody is thinking about, hey, we want to chase these 15 elements of data, and we think that's going to be the success. And this community is doing this thing, and this community is doing this thing, and there's no synchronization. And those conferences and symposiums are a great opportunity to come together and share some of those lessons observed so that they can be lessons learned. And so my hope is, the H2F conference was a little bit better this year than it has been in the past. And my hope is that going forward, they can learn from that. And the same thing in the aircrew world, and the same thing in SOCOM. I don't know who the right agency is to synchronize, all these various programs. And you have some other outside elements who have been doing this stuff for a very long time, Usarium, and I forget the organization that Patty Doyster works for, and
Champ.
Champ. So there's some organizations that have been doing this stuff for a super long time. I mean, I wrote my thesis at War College on combat fitness in 2009, and I interviewed people like Patty and Glenn Mercer and Craig Glassman, and I mean, like, you just people, Alan Lim from the cycling community. I interviewed a whole bunch of people and trying to figure out, how we could do this. But unfortunately, in the military, you have all these different tribes and stovepipes that are kind of doing their own thing. and there's no central repository or venue to bring it together.
We've talked about this.
Drew has some questions he's going to ask you, but since
So
you
many
set up a
times.
perfect opportunity for a shameless plug,
Hopefully someone's listening.
I don't know if anybody who has anything to do with these decisions is listening. I don't know if they ever will, but man, he sounds like he's describing a DoD Human Performance Directorate that serves a coordinating role across all these things, captures some of this stuff, saves this expertise in a senior way at a headquarters level that can guide organizations if they implement it.
Do you think if it became that high up, I mean, inevitably bureaucracy would take over and it would get ruined?
There's no doubt. There's no doubt. The higher it goes, the more controlling they get. But I feel so passionate about this issue that I think, we got to start somewhere. You got to put something in place that tries to synchronize, that tries to collect, and tries to educate and provide some kind of central repository for processes and procedures at work. And I'll give you a good example. Special Warfare Training Wing at Lackland, community that's near and dear to me. When they stood up that wing, they gave a senior master sergeant a pile of money and said, go buy a whole bunch of sensors so that we can start collecting data. And then, whatever, 3-4 years later, they now have a human performance squadron and a human performance group. And those gentlemen 2 years ago at the Aircrew Performance Symposium really debunked most of those sensors. And so my point about that is, why wouldn't we want to communicate that across the community so that the DoD doesn't spend any more money on device X? And I don't want to call anybody out because it's not my expertise, but I think you get the idea.
That's what we do on LinkedIn. That's what
I was gonna say. We'll call them out.
That's okay. But my point is, why wouldn't we want to use the research that they did to say, hey, these devices don't really provide the information that you want to to be more effective. And that, I think that's a perfect example of something that we're relearning over and over. Now technology is increasing and things are getting better, and that doesn't mean that the device won't mature into something that's valuable, but at least in that version we should be talking about it.
I don't know. There may never be a place for force plates in the military. That might be too specific. I want to ask, so Alex, I mean, we'll get back into more of the technicalities, but I do want to ask you just some like foundational questions that I know I kind of intentionally brought up in our last episode as a way of like lighting some fires. But I'm curious because I hear about these sorts of gripes, I guess. And I think what it would boil down to your point, is just not understanding the whole process. And so, like from a money standpoint, when you are bidding on a contract, I would assume you kind of know your competition. Do you know roughly the dollar value that different folks are going to throw in? Like, is it like an auction in a way? I mean, obviously not as electric, but like if I'm bidding for a human performance contract against you, do we have a sense of where we're each going to come in at, or is that too simple?
Well, first and foremost, you have to understand what the requirement is. Like if for instance, if company X bid and won a contract for the exact same requirement in a different place, then yes, I can backwards engineer the rates that they are going to bid. Now, I think something that's really important for people to understand is that the government pays a certain price for the position. And let's just use round numbers. For instance, if the government is paying $100,000 for the position every year, now the company is going to pay a salary. Let's just say that the company pays a salary of $70,000 a year, right? every company has to pay what's called fringe. This is your statutory taxes and your fringe benefits you offer your employees. I'll just say, in general, industry average 30% fringe, right? So $70,000 plus 30% fringe is $21,000. That now you're at $91,000. And you still have to pay what we call overhead, the cost of running the contract. Now, all the people on the contract or all the people in that area can help pay for that overhead cost. And then you have a cost to run your company, your G&A cost. And that G&A cost pays for your buildings, your staff, all the stuff, the recruiting tools that we have, the business development tools, the DCAA compliant cost accounting systems, all of those things that it pays for. And then what's left over is what we call profit. And so if we're at $91,000, my G&A might be 10%. My overhead might be 10%. And I'm not getting home if I pay that guy $70,000, right? Like I spent more on that position than what the bid allowed for, right? So let's just say we used 60,000 as a salary and we paid 30% fringe. That would be $78,000, right? We got 22,000 left. We're paying 10% G&A. That's another $6,000. That's 84,000. $6,000 on top of that for G&A. That's $90,000. Now you have $10,000 left over as your profit, right? So the lower that $100,000 is, the lower that people bid, the less you have to operate. And normally you work that bid price, you start with the salary. What is the industry average salary? Or and depending on what work you're doing, you could say, and there are lots of tools out there. We use ERI to give us a range of salaries for the specific job based on experience and education in the location that they're at. And we use that, but they give you 10%, 25%, 50%, 75%, 100%. And you as a company determine, where on the spectrum you're going to bid those salaries at. One of the things that you guys didn't talk about that I think is really, really important to understand is that, really for the longest time, the human performance professionals across all of the different LCATs have been historically depressed. My personal opinion, colleges and universities took advantage of your passion and they're doing it today. Like I talked to somebody the other day, said he got offered a job for $32,000 a year. Tell me how that's a living wage. It's not, but that's the industry you guys are in. And so when I go to ERI, it takes that information, all the spectrums. It takes the NSC, the salary data that you see that NSCA collects or CCSCA or USA Today, all of those things are taken into account. But the issue ultimately comes back to the historic salaries that coaches have been paid. And remember, and Drew, this, you worked in the profession. If you're working at the college level, you're working 60, 80 hours a week, and lots of people who want to come to tactical are looking for not just an opportunity to work with some of the most elite people in the military. They're also looking for family balance, right? They're looking for that 40 hours a week. And, if I'm paying close to or the same as NCAA salaries, even Division II, but you're only working 40 hours a week, the opportunity looks pretty good. But when you get there and you're like, hey, those POTUF guys are making, 20,000 more, it's a different requirement, different contract, a different bid time. And so it's not as easy. And so those factors, how pricing is done, and people get caught up in that all the time. They say, hey, you guys are you're charging the government 100,000 for a guy, and you're only paying him $67,000 a year. And I would say, yeah, well, I'm making like $2,000 a year on that position, So, and oh, by the way, I have all the risk, right? Like, I got protests going on right now on a contract that won in Arizona, and I got to pay for legal fees. So, there's the cost of running your business, and that I think is everybody just thinks it's America and we're making a ton of money. It's it's not necessarily the case.
Is there a way to, I mean, one, I appreciate you diving into that, because I think you're spot on. And I know you hear probably more than I do, that people just assume that, you're making, it's $1 million and you're only paying me 10,000, you're walking away with all this money as you climb into your Lamborghini. Is there a way from a business standpoint to maybe like recalibrate that math so that the salary doesn't take a hit? Because as you were telling me all of that, the first thing that comes to mind is like, man, this is another check in the box that we keep spitting out of, like, the NSCA needs to do a better job of promoting higher salaries for coaches, because if we're basing it off of collegiate salary data, you're always going to underpay people because those guys don't make any money at all.
That's right.
And we've bitched about that to no end. We'll continue to do it.
But I would tell you, there's a couple of things that I told the NSCA, and I've been telling them this for a couple of years now. And, for reference, I attended the very first TSAC conference in 2011. And so I've been around this for a long time. And it's probably about 3 years ago, I was working with Jason Soleil that, to build a white paper that they could provide to the government or professional sports that would provide a levels of coaches based upon experience, education, training, certifications. And my personal opinion is you could associate some salary ranges with that. You could associate some capabilities with that. And I'm really driving towards that leadership and management capability that I think a lot of strength coaches and for the most part, a lot of human performance professionals are not exposed to. They're not given the opportunity to lead a team, and in a multidisciplinary team in an environment like we have on H2F or OHWS. And so what I told the NSAA, and to be honest with you, I'll think of the guy's name in a minute. He came up to me afterwards in this working group I was in and said they're working on it, because at the annual conference in January, I got an opportunity to spend about 15 minutes with the current president. At that time, he was coming in to take over the NSCA. And we laid this out to him, as I had done a couple of times before. And I guess they took that for action. And so they said that they're working on that levels of coaches thing. The other thing that I would say is that you should provide a leadership track for coaches. And the reason I say that is no other labor category is doing that for their community. And if you want to find yourself in leadership roles, in leadership opportunities to grow and mature, not just as a coach, but as a leader, that baseline training, that baseline understanding will serve those coaches better. And if we start, and I'm not saying because you build a white paper, the military is going to automatically adopt it, right? But you have to provide some guidance, some information for them to base their decisions on. And you might say, and contracting and the people who write the requirements might say, well, if you have 400 coaches, then you should build in management. And I would say to you, does it say that in the RFP?
Mm-hmm.
Does it ask me to have managers in there? Does it require me? Because if I put them in there, I'm not going to win. Right? The government says, hey, I want 400 3-year coaches. That's what you got to bid. If you bid now, if it's best value and there's some opportunity and how you structure your management approach, then there might be an opportunity to factor in some of those things. But my point in saying this to you, Drew, is that like I really believe the NSCA as an organization can't tell the military that you got to pay people more. What they have to do is create tools with which to help the military make better decisions about how they make their acquisitions, and then prepare your coaches better for future opportunities in terms of being a leader or manager.
So because you got really close to bringing it up there, and because Drew was talking about like advocacy for paying people more and things like that, I got to ask like directly, because it came up in the episode we did before. We're dancing around it now. As much as we complain about it, and you mentioned like colleges and universities are taking advantage of people's passion. I talk about passion tax all the time for all these industries that can get away with paying less because the jobs are cool, whatever, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Is there going to be any forcing function to change any of this as long as the positions keep getting filled?
I guess I would ask you, what do you mean by forcing function to change things?
Because basically what I'm saying is like there's constant waves of complaints from coaches that these salaries aren't high enough. They're not adjusted for location enough. Like we deserve more than this, these degrees, yada, yada, yada. And I would argue in a perfect world, I totally agree. But the problem is you're all here in these jobs right now.
That's
Like
right.
if it needed to be more, you wouldn't be in the job
That's
because you'd
right.
be somewhere else getting paid. Like
That's how
it's like
economics
that's the
works.
reality we're fighting against. Like at the end of the day, capitalism is a thing.
Yeah, I would tell you, I think this is not unique to coaches.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter what contract I have. Like my shooting instructors in San Diego, do they want to get paid more? Yeah, they want to get paid more. If I asked them, would they say, how much more do you want to get
No,
paid?
we're
Yeah,
good.
I live in San Diego. I'm not getting paid enough. Or, my, engineering technical people in Keyport, Washington, they want to get paid more too. I don't think it's unique to the strength or the human performance industry. I think people by nature want to get paid more, feel like they're being undervalued, feel like they're not being compensated for the services that they provide. And I'm not going to discount the value of the work that the professionals on any contract in the government provide, right? They do provide it. I probably work 12 or 14 hours a day. I'm an entrepreneur, but they're not working that hard. They're not, that's what I say about that. Colleges and universities are taking advantage of what you said, the passion tax. They're smoking those guys and paying them. And this, both of you know this as well as I do. Since H2F was awarded, colleges and university salaries have gone up to compete
Yep.
with the tactical field, right?
Yeah.
And so now when the next generation of H2F comes around, or the next generation of OHWS, or even POTIF, maybe those salaries are a little bit higher. I don't know how that plays out, right? POTIF is going to be recompeted, pretty soon too. And those coaches they've been paid the most of pretty much everybody but elite D1 and professional coaches for the longest time. And their salaries haven't gone up. They've been pretty stagnant at that level for a very long time.
How do you, like, we mentioned this, I think, in our last episode, we certainly mentioned it before, but there's a reality here, and me as a former contractor can speak to this. There's what's in your position of work statement, and then which is what you get paid for. But then there's actually what you kind of do on a day-to-day basis. And in a lot of cases, especially with what we see like in H2F as an example, and POTF and all the other ones, it's what those men and women do kind of outside the scope, quote unquote, that really drives a lot of the success in some of these programs. And I mean, in some cases, it's what senior leaders brief off of as examples of like, hey, things are going really well because we're seeing compliance through the roof and blah, 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 blah. Some of that is because coaches are kind of working in the gray area because they're good people. From like a business standpoint, where does that fit into the conversation? Because I guess what I'm getting at here is you're sort of paying somebody for a set of requirements, but you're kind of understanding that the success of your contract, I guess, experience across that number of years kind of hinges on a lot of people working outside their scope in some sense. Does that make any sense at all?
I understand what you're saying. I might not necessarily agree with it.
Please disagree. That's what I was hoping, that you would have a different perspective.
I would ask you, for specifics where people are working outside of their job description. In many instances, I will say I want to stay within the confines of the PWS or statement of work because, it puts me at risk. It also puts the government at risk. And so the government, the Corps in general, and we're not going to talk about any specific contracts in general, if the Corps knew that somebody was working outside the confines of the PWS or the statement of work, they would tell you to cease and desist because there's risk associated with that. The risk is that you're providing services the government's not paying for. And then the government could be financially liable at some point. Or, when you're doing something that's not in the PWS, then you're not servicing the PWS requirements. And so, I'll go back to, give me an example of what you're talking about so that I can be more specific. I don't disagree that people work on the edges of the PWS. Again, who writes the PWS? Mm-hmm. Government people write the PWS who don't entirely understand what it is they want or what, as the contract matures and evolves, what that contract looks like. Now, I'll say this, that I'll give you an example, the H2F contract, the PWS and requirements of that contract changed in this most recent solicitation. So at least we know that the Army is looking at that to ensure that they're maturing and evolving as the contract continues to mature and evolve. Does that mean they're going to be 100% correct or they're going to get everything right? Not necessarily, but that's a conversation. So if I knew a coach, let's just say that the coach was helping move the gym from one building to the next, and we know that that's not in the PWS. Mm-hmm. That is probably something that has gone on some of these contracts. If that coach drops a weight on their foot, or Sergeant Snuffy drops a weight on my coach's foot, guess who's dealing with a workers' comp case now for something that I wasn't on contract to do? And so that's where I say there's risk associated for both sides of the equation, as an example. Mm-hmm. But you also, you also want to ensure success of the mission. And that's where I think you see some people operating in the gray area, on the edges, to make sure the mission gets done.
Yeah, I think the challenge, just like my closing thought on that, because the example you used was actually the one I had in mind. I mean, I've been the guy moving the gym, and it's not
Yeah.
technically in your, you know what I mean?
Yep.
And I think that there's kind of a reoccurring theme in a lot of these talking points, which is that the nature of, at least in my opinion, the nature of the kind of human performance space is that it really boils down to like human relationships, which is a very squishy thing. I mean, we've talked about it on a lot of different kind of platforms, but especially with contracting, which is kind of meant to be very objective and metrics driven. And we want 100 printers. Here's 100 printers. They print 100 pages. But like in this case, we're dealing with human beings interacting with human beings, and that can introduce a lot of gray. And so I can't, I guess what it goes back to is just us creating a DoD specific human performance office that, maybe Alex and I run. Who knows? Who knows? But that was the example you used was the exact one I had in mind.
Yeah, well, if they put out a GS job, you might want to be on the lookout for it.
Well, Drew brought it around nicely to a couple questions I want to ask, because at the end of the day, this is the Mops and Mo's podcast. So we should probably talk about measures of performance and measures of effectiveness, at least a little bit. And
Sure.
so I got two related to that I think you'd have insight on. And the first one is, you've been around human performance long enough to have an idea of what works, what doesn't work, what the important things are. If you had the chance to mentor somebody who was doing technical evaluation criteria for something like this, what would you tell them is like the way they should evaluate for effectiveness? Like, what would you put in something like that to make sure that you're going to get the best value, the best actual impact on the outcomes the government is hoping to improve?
Yeah, that's a good question, Alex. But I think that the answer that I would give you is more holistic in nature, and we can just use the H2F stats that Dr. Thompson presented at the conference, right? Like the success of the program somewhat is dependent upon the data collection and analysis to get to where he got to. He's a unique individual and has really, I think, in the, I'll say 20 some years that I've been 30 years that I've been doing this, really presented something that was super impactful. And I don't think that there's like, if let's just use in terms of strength coaches, that you're supposed to provide programming for the battalion, company, down to the squad level, if asked, right? Or even at the individual level. And personalities matter, and so each battalion is a little bit different in how they apply that. The programming, I don't think, leads to those effectiveness measures that Dr. Thompson. It's the holistic nature of the program, I think, that has proven to be successful. And so it's almost like if you were going to dissect some movements and provide specific training criteria, as you train a running back or a quarterback or a lineman or, something like that, how you could be very specific by dissecting the specific moves they have to present. In this case, I think you want that coach to be able to provide that effective programming. And then you also want that coach to work closely with the injury staff and be able to implement effective programming consistent with the injuries that are there. Of course, you want to do it preventing injuries, and then you want to tie in your cognitive performance specialist and how those things work together. I know I'm not answering your question, Alex, but I think in terms of effectiveness, the metrics of saying I presented, X amount of plans, or I have, and we measure on the Air Force contract, we measure engagements, how many treatments we provide, how many, from month over month for the last 5 years. I mean, we provide, thousands and thousands of reports to the government. And those are measures they're following, but does it tell the effectiveness story? And I don't think any one of those things tells the effectiveness. I think it's the combination of the services provided. But it starts with this, and I wanted to say this, and this really goes back to what Drew was saying too, is it is humans. And one of the things that I think is really important for human performance staff to know is that they really have to build trust and confidence with the people they're working with. And I know most people know that, right? Like you step into a flying squadron and the pilots are looking at you, or you're in a special tactics squadron and the operators are looking at these people saying, who are you and what are you going to do for me? And, those people are looking at them like, oh my God, who are these people? And how am I going to convince them that the knowledge I have can help them be better? And that personable skills, that trust building, that, relationship building is critical to what we're doing. And personalities matter. I say that a lot. The battalion commander, the battalion sergeant major, the brigade commander, the brigade sergeant major, those people matter. Like, because if they're in favor of the program, then you got carte blanche. But if they're skeptical of the program, or hey, I want my MFTs, I want my NCOs to run this stuff. So you stand on the side and guide it. And I'm not saying one way is wrong or right. It's just the dynamic that we're in, and the people who are providing those services have to understand the situation and the personalities involved. And I think we in our company do a really good job of providing that professional development to help guys understand how do you build that trust and confidence? How do you convince the government that you have something to add to that situation? And so all those things play into the effectiveness.
So there were a lot of things there that get to the core of kind of what the whole point of this platform is and what we're talking about with Mops and Mo's. One, I will say, regular listeners will note that that's like the 5th time Dr. Andrew Thompson has been mentioned on this podcast at this point. Andrew, we know you're getting close to that 2-year mark and your probationary period is going to be over. We're going to schedule you for like the week after it ends to get you on here and talk.
night of, because it'll happen during business hours. So then he's clear.
It's true.
I've gotten the email before. He's good to go.
I was also listening as you were answering, and I know you had to navigate that question carefully because it's tough and it's complicated and things like that. But you did point out that we rely heavily on measures of performance in this space rather than measures of effectiveness. Andrew has obviously done some really cool work in illustrating effectiveness and like sorting through some very frustrating data and stuff. And it's important work that I think human performance programs are realizing they all have to do at this point. I'll drill down on you a little bit with the question and ask it in like a simpler way that might make it easier to answer.
Okay.
When contractors are getting evaluated by the government, are they getting evaluated on actual effectiveness, or are they getting evaluated on performance metrics like what percentage of the positions were filled for what percentage of the time? Like I don't know what that interaction looks like at that juncture.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there are medical providers, what are called known as personal services contracts. Your athletic trainers, physical therapists, performance dietitians. I'm sure there's a couple that I'm missing, but in general, if you are on a personal services contract, or should be on a personal services contract where you're providing some of those type services, then you are under the observation of a medical provider to ensure the services that you provide are technically compliant, technically effective, and so that's half of that equation. In terms of, at the pointy end of the spear, the government is not technically evaluating our coaches or massage therapists or sports psychologists, because that's a non-personal services contract, right? Like that's the evaluation is not of the person. The evaluation for the company comes from the overall contract performance. And the government uses a tool called the Contracting Performance Assessment Report, CPAR. And that's issued by the government every year to individual companies. And there are, and I forgive me, I don't remember the areas that they look at, but they, technically compliant, and the, how you spend money, what your management is, how your engagement with the government is. And so they give you a grade, like your performance report in the Army or in the Air Force, except it's for contracting companies, and it's logged in a big system in the sky for all contractors. And it's, in theory, used in evaluations for future contracts. And so, that report, that CPAR, is the tool that the government measures your performance on. And there's some effectiveness and some not. But in general, they're going to base it upon a number of factors, like you said, vacancy rates. They're gonna if you had, Susie Q, caused a big stir, and there's a problem. Hey, how did you handle that problem? How quickly did you take care of it? Did you implement procedures and policies that prevent it from happening again? And so all of those things factor into that CPAR. So in terms of measuring the contractor, that's the tool that I would tell you they use. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think as much as we're in a giant bureaucracy, we already talked about that. We don't have enough time to get that deep into it. I got to ask one that's like a little bit bureaucratic. I don't know if you have any insight into this one. I have no idea. But we mentioned it on the last episode talking about contracting, that there are two primary exceptions where you can do personal services contracts, special operations and medical. Do you see there being any room, because you just talked about how non-personal services contracts limit the ability to evaluate the effectiveness of the actual people providing the service, which seems important to all this stuff. Do you see there either being any possibility or any value to a discussion about a personal services exemption for human performance specifically?
That's an interesting thought. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you, because I'd have to think about that. Personal services contracts present their own challenges, and for as much as we want to get that effective oversight and guidance, there's still plenty of opportunity where those things aren't taking place. And so there's two parts to that equation, and part of the challenge there is that it's very few and far between on the military side for people who understand that difference between those two contracts types and the responsibilities that are associated with both. And you see it today on the H2F contract, or you probably see this, when you're dealing, you have this athletic trainer contract, and then you have this strength coach contract, and they're totally different. And you want to be running them the same way, and you're like, well, what's going on here? And so the education part of that makes it more difficult. And to be honest with you, you look at SOCOM, POTFF is the only personal services contract in SOCOM. That's it. Only one. And, the other personal services contracts that I know of are all totally related to that medical service portion of the work, where you have to submit your credentialing package through the military treatment facility, and the military treatment facility has to sign off on that person, and then they're assigned a medical provider to provide that oversight and feedback process. And so when those professionals are putting notes in the system in MHS Genesis, those providers are supposed to be providing oversight on that.
Before we let you go, because I think we could ask you contracting questions all night, I wanted to just kind of open it up and say, having listened to the last episode where we somewhat intentionally made absolute fools of ourselves, what stones have we left unturned thus far in our conversation with you? What other points are important to address so that people understand or have a better idea of how this all works?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that I think is that coaches and really employees across a number of different professions need to understand that, we're not intentionally bidding at a rate that we know is going to totally screw people over. And I'll say this, there's times when companies make a mistake, right? Like, hey, let's say we're putting coaches at Fort Polk. So if you don't bid the right amount of salary in those various places, Alaska is a good example. Overseas provides some very significant challenges or areas where companies could make a mistake. But, the reality is, we're trying to provide services to the government. Don't get me wrong. There are some companies that have a very different approach to execution. They're few and far between in the human performance world. They're not as prevalent. In the other work that I do, and we do work at the NGA, and I have 5 contracts with the Navy and Department of Hearing and Appeals, and a lot of different places across the Air Force. There are companies that are intentionally bidding low in an effort in hopes that the government will adjust their contract downstream. And I don't think that that's necessarily happening. I think people make mistakes. I think the athletic trainer contract was bid pretty low. I mean, we bid on it, and I was surprised, but I don't know that they did that on purpose. And so that's what I would say. Like, I don't think it's intentional. I think the most important thing for people to understand is that just because you have 5 years or 10 years or 20 years experience as a coach doesn't mean that I'm going to pay you more. Because the government said, I want a coach with 3 years. Like, this is the job I have, and this is the salary we're paying. And I get it if you take the job and you say, hey, I got 10 years experience, I should get more. And I said, well, this is what the government is paying for this position. And a year from now, it didn't change. Like we got some escalation because that's what we put in our proposal. But if I get escalation in my company, that escalation goes right to the individual. So, if you bid 2% or 3% escalation, those people are getting that pay raise at the end of the year. So my point is, like, I would love to have, 100 coaches who have 10 years or 20 years experience, but the government's not asking for that. And if you want to work in the tactical industry and you want to go to POTIF, or you want to go to some of these other contracts that require 5 years tactical, college, or pro sports, then you got to start somewhere. And, my program manager and good friend Matt Parvis would tell you, like, you got to have a plan. You can't just be a coach forever. You need an education, you need experience, you need leadership training, you need to understand how government contracting works, and you need to kind of have a plan as you go into it. And even when I was in the military, I would tell people, like, you don't let the military make your plan for you. You should make a plan and try to make that happen in the military. And, we all know the plan is, thrown out the window after the first engagement, but at least you have a plan to diverge from, right? And I think the coaches who want to be in tactical, it's a very admirable job. Our military needs it more than ever. With 28 years in the service and all the things that I did, 3,000 parachute jumps, I understand that what we're doing today in the terms of human performance will help preserve the force, will help increase our operational availability and our operational longevity. And so it's super important. And we want the best people to do it. We just, as contracting companies, we just pay what the government pays us. I'll say not all companies are like that. There are certainly companies out there trying to make money on it. But that in understanding that aspect of it is, I think, one of the more important things. And then I'm happy to describe, that finance process of how salaries are determined. And just because the government's paying me X doesn't mean the difference between your salary and X is what I'm making in profit, because I got to pay for a whole bunch of other stuff to, pay for you as a person and pay for how we run our company. So I appreciate the opportunity, guys. I'm happy to come back on at a later date if you want to have more conversation. And as always, I'm trying to drive the ball down and score the touchdown.
No, this was perfect. And like, again, we prefaced this the first time we did the contracting episode. We wanted to be proven wrong on a lot of those points. So thank you for stepping up and having the conversation with us. I think this was hopefully very informative. And quite frankly, I would hope that, like, as this industry grows, people can kind of come back to this conversation to your point, hopefully get a better understanding of how this all works. So again, thank you. I'll say this again when we do the introductions to this episode, but, like, hopefully people understand now that we've put these 2 episodes together, which the one we had about, like, why contracting is killing strength and conditioning, and then now having a contracting specialist come on and answer some of those questions. The whole intent there was to pull some truths out. And I think Chris did a beautiful job of really getting into the weeds, but really not even getting close to how much into the weeds we could have gotten. I mean, hopefully people got a sense of, like, just the bureaucracy involved in this is insane.
Drew, are you familiar with Cunningham's law?
No.
This has nothing to do with any of the stuff we normally talk about, but Cunningham's law is that the best way to get an answer on the internet is not to ask a question. It is to post a wrong answer and wait for a correction.
There we go.
We leveraged Cunningham's law on this.
We got
one.
the most amount of hate from our contracting is killing strength, which is good. I mean,
So that's fascinating. This tells you which of the two of us people come to when they have feedback. I got almost no feedback on the contracting episode. I didn't hear anything.
Well, you sent me the DM from the dude that just like ripped me a new one.
Oh, well, the guy said you were stupid, but I mean, you are
fine.
Stupid. So.
I'll take that. I'll wear that mantle. But no, I think
you got much more feedback from that episode than I did.
I got a lot of face palms, but I know a lot of people in contracting.
I was going to say you have a lot more interaction with the industry than I do on that side of it.
Which is fine because, again, I think there's this kind of reality of the situation in tactical strength and conditioning, which is that most, if not all of these jobs are contracted positions. And so to Chris's point, like it behooves coaches to understand that either before they get in or once they are in and they have certain gripes or whatever, they can maybe gain some clarity from the conversation we have with Chris.
You've been working around the Army too long.
It's only been 3.5 years.
Just dropping a behooves in there like that.
That's not an Army word. That's a French word.
That is 100%
behooves?
Sergeant Major catchphrase territory. Yeah.
Is it?
Piggyback off what the commander just said. It would behoove you to,
What was the one I always heard? I'm going to double tap, curb stomp, foot, table slap, all of them. So yeah. Anyway, I don't know if this should we say that we're going to leave the contracting conversation open-ended? So it is a two-parter, but certainly there could be more to come.
Yeah, I think we've got room for conversations. I think one thing I've had feedback from the audience on is we've had a lot of senior leader type personalities on here recently. And I think that's good and it provides valuable perspective and it's cool to pin those guys down and get their thoughts. And I think we probably have a due out here for some on the ground perspectives, some where the rubber meets the road perspectives. And I imagine some of that will touch on the experience of being a contractor. If we get some like coaches out here to talk about it, and who knows what they're allowed to talk about, and hopefully they don't get fired and all that stuff. But
yeah,
it'd be good to get some like on the ground coach thoughts on here. And there's been some like specific requests for like NCO perspective on the whole thing. And we need to pursue that at maybe not the senior NCO of the entire DoD. We might need to grab somebody who's like doing it at a more
We're going top down
level.
We're going top down. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Hey Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.